Sandy Lopez was out of the state county jail and could finally breathe the air of freedom. Her heart, tired of life behind bars, was singing in her chest. Freedom. What could be better? Sandy thought as she made her way to the bus stop. She got sentenced to time in prison for virtually nothing. The woman was convicted on false charges. As an accountant at one of the city's trading firms, Sandy made the mistake of signing some documents, which later turned out to be fake. Of course, if Connor Thompson hadn't asked the woman for it, she would never have done so. But the young head of the department used all of his charm in order to persuade his subordinate to make the decision he needed. It was only later that Sandy understood that Connor blatantly lied to her face in order to frame her. Back then, life seemed like a fairy tale that would last forever. Connor knew exactly what buttons to push to make the woman submit to his will. Sandy's weakness was her son, Bobby, whom she had with her ex-husband. The boy was only 3 years old, and the single mother made every effort to ensure he was never in need of anything. Thus, Connor decided to use Bobby to implement his criminal plan. He intentionally gave the boy gifts and took his mother to restaurants and cafes. He warmed his way into Sandy's life by giving her hope for a future together. Of course, Sandy's friends and acquaintances warned her of the possible danger. But when you're 25 and you're a single mother, you see many of the men who pay attention to you and your kiddo as a potential husband. Especially since Connor was Sandy's boss, which she believed spoke to his character. The naive young woman truly believed that her life would soon take a turn for the better. If Sandy could have only known what a bitter disappointment she was in for. The epiphany was painful and shocking. The sweet dream ended as quickly as it began. Having put her signature on those ill-fated documents, Sandy didn't just put an end to her career, but also lost her freedom for 3 long years. Since little Bobby was left without parents, the social services had no choice but to place him in an orphanage. Sandy was devastated by the separation from her son, but there was nothing she could do. Her parents died 7 years ago, so there was simply no one to take care of the boy while she was away. "It's okay, I'll definitely get out of here," Sandy whispered, looking at the barred window. The woman couldn't get over the fact that she'd been framed and betrayed so cruelly. During the trial, Connor Thompson testified against her and didn't even say a word about the fact that the accountant was acting on his orders. It seemed as if he was a completely different person. When the judge read out the verdict, not a single muscle flinched on his face. Thus, the unfortunate woman had to change her cozy office for a cell in the woman's block of the state county jail. And now, having served 2/3 of her sentence, she was finally released on parole. All this time, the woman kept thinking about her son and dreamed of seeing him as soon as possible. 3 years isn't a terrible sentence, but to an innocent person, it feels like an eternity. So it was with Sandy, who crossed off days on her calendar every evening. At such moments, she consoled herself with the fact that there have always been people who got convicted on false charges and were forced to endure the difficult trials that fell to their lot. It was then that Sandy started feeling a special kind of respect for the hero of the Dumas novel, who was innocent but ended up spending several years in prison. Freedom was intoxicating and dizzying. The woman felt like the hard part was finally behind her, and nothing could get in her way of her happiness. Having arrived in her native town in northern Kentucky, Sandy decided to put off her visit to the orphanage. Thus, she was sitting in the director's waiting room the very next morning. Priscilla Morrison gave her guest an appraising look, then carefully studied the documents provided by the parole board. As Mrs. Morrison was reading the report, the wrinkles on her forehead became deeper and deeper. Finally, she put it aside and, clasping her fingers in lock, expressed her opinion. "Mrs. Lopez, I understand your situation, of course. Bobby is your son, and he misses his mom very much. But you're an ex-convict. What kind of an example will you set for your son? How are you going to provide for him?" "I'll get a job, of course. Just let me take Bobby home," Sandy pleaded. Priscilla Morrison's answer was very harsh. "I'm sorry, but I can't do that. The environment where the child will be raised is very important to us. Improve your financial situation and marital status to begin with, and then we can return to this conversation." "What do you mean? Do I need to get married? I'm sure I can find a job, but what about my marital status? It's not like I can just get married right away. Please let me take my son home," the woman pleaded with tears in her eyes. "This is my final answer, and one more thing. I don't think you should see your son just yet. It will only unsettle him. He's already adapted to life at the orphanage." Priscilla Morrison answered in a tone that brooked no objections. Despair froze in Sandy's eyes. The woman's heart was broken. She was devastated to learn that she wouldn't be able to even see her son. Sandy was willing to do anything to get Bobby back, and there was no changing Mrs. Morrison's decision. Realizing the futility of her efforts, Sandy said goodbye and left the director's office. At that moment, the only thing she could think about was how to get her son out of the orphanage as soon as possible. "Hold on, Bobby. I will definitely get you out of there," Sandy kept whispering. The young woman decided to get right on it and immediately started looking for a job. Unfortunately, the naive young woman didn't take into account one detail. It took her a while to realize that there weren't many employers who were willing to hire an ex-convict. Sandy realized that she could forget about getting a job in accounting on her first day of the search. Trying to find a simpler job, Sandy had to go around at least a dozen offices before she stumbled upon an ad looking for a cleaner to work in one of the restaurants of the city. It was hanging on the restaurant's door and immediately caught the eye of the desperate young woman. Sandy entered the restaurant and went to see the director, trembling with agitation. Alfred Brooks turned out to be a nice and smart man who immediately decided to help the ex-convict. In addition to the fact that the director hired Sandy, he promised to write a character reference for her, which was something that Priscilla Morrison had mentioned during their meeting. "Well, finally, the first step is done. Now all I have to do is find a husband, and I'll get Bobby back," Sandy thought ironically. Despite the fact that working at the restaurant wasn't easy, the ex-convict liked her job. It didn't involve as much responsibility, she wasn't in charge of any documents, so she wasn't risking losing her freedom again. Working 12 hours a day, Sandy knew that she was getting closer to the time when she and Bobby would finally become a family once again. One day, as the woman was on her way home, a very strange scene unfolded right before her eyes. 3 drunken men were attacking a man who looked like he was homeless. The forces were unequal, and the unfortunate man struggled to keep his balance and protect his head from their blows. Sandy's first thought was to walk past them and pretend that she didn't see anything. But when Sandy looked into the homeless man's eyes, she realized that she wouldn't be able to forgive herself if she didn't at least attempt to help him. Clutching her purse in her hand, the woman bravely threw herself into the thick of the fight. At that point, Sandy didn't realize when she was risking getting into even more trouble, which she was so carefully trying to avoid lately. Sandy had always been so very courageous, so her intervention in the fight immediately changed the balance of power in favor of the unfortunate homeless man. Seeing the angry woman in front of them, the attackers backed away and rushed to get out of there. It was one thing to fight a defenseless homeless man, but attacking a respectable resident of the city was a completely different matter altogether, especially since she could have easily called the police. Thus, the young woman's courage and determination helped save the innocent homeless man, whose only fault was the fact that he was unfortunate enough to walk past the drunken trio. "How are you? Are you okay? Should I call an ambulance?" Sandy asked cautiously. No need for an ambulance. My head's fine, and the rest are just some minor bruises," the man hastened to reassure his savior. Sandy looked at his bloodied face and old, torn clothes and shook her head. Deep down, she really wanted to help the poor fellow who got into such a terrible situation. And therefore, mentally weighing all the pros and the cons, Sandy invited the man to come over so he could wash his face and get himself in order. "Don't worry, I live alone. I used to be in prison until recently," Sandy added, catching the man's wary look. The young man relaxed visibly, and his lips stretched into a sweet smile. As it turned out a little later, the homeless man's name was Gabriel. He was given such a name at the orphanage, which had been his home for a very long time. The mere mention of that place gave Sandy a headache. According to Gabriel, he couldn't handle the independent life after leaving the orphanage. Deprived of shelter and livelihood, he became homeless, earning his living by doing odd jobs. After taking a bath, Gabriel looked much better, which Sandy couldn't help but take note of. If he had some decent clothes on and got a haircut, he would be a completely different person, almost an eligible bachelor. The woman thought to herself, "Wait a minute, why didn't I think of this sooner? What if—" Sandy's face brightened and her eyes radiated hope. Gabriel looked at the landlady in surprise and smiled. The man's reaction seemed to have pushed Sandy to take decisive action, forcing her to say something that seemed rather insane. "How would you feel about getting fake married? Please don't think I'm crazy. I really need your help. It's not just a whim or something, but the conditions I got from the director of the orphanage. My son had to spend 3 years there, but I can't get him out unless I find a job and get married." Sandy blurted out quickly. Gabriel was taken by surprise, so much so that he was literally lost for words. Sandy's proposal sounded so unusual that the man even started blushing. It took Gabriel some time to realize what exactly Sandy was asking of him and why she was doing it. He couldn't say no to the young woman, and thus, after some deliberation, he agreed to get fake married. "Thank you, I really appreciate your help and support," Sandy said, having a hard time holding back her tears. Gabriel shrugged his shoulders timidly and muttered something about how he wasn't doing anything special. Since the young people weren't going to hold a wedding ceremony and thus didn't need to prepare for it, they started implementing their plan the very next day. For starters, Sandy brought Gabriel some new clothes so he wouldn't feel like a black sheep in the city hall. "Wow, I haven't worn such clothes for a long time," Gabriel exclaimed with admiration. Sandy smiled and gently pushed him towards the door. The city hall was unusually crowded. As it turned out, 2 other couples also wanted to get married on the same day. Their guests were all dressed up in expensive suits and dresses, which made it clear that they were some rich and influential people. Feeling out of place, Gabriel stepped aside to wait for their turn. At that moment, one of the men standing by the opposite wall looked at the young man and, clutching his heart, turned white as chalk. "Mr. Anderson, are you all right?" exclaimed someone in the crowd. But the old man didn't seem to notice anyone but Gabriel. Moreover, barely managing to hold his emotions in check, the man pointed his finger at Gabriel and wheezed. "Son, this is my son." Gabriel felt very uncomfortable. He already realized that the man had simply mistaken him for someone else. But the businessman wasn't about to calm down. He pushed through the crowd and went towards Gabriel. Tears were streaming down the man's face, and his hands were trembling as if he was having a seizure. Hugging the astonished Gabriel, the businessman kept repeating over and over again, "Son." Gabriel's initial instinct was to simply run away. The last thing he expected was what eventually happened. The young man just stood there and couldn't figure out what he was supposed to do. Some strange man was calling him son, despite the fact that Gabriel had never seen him before. According to the businessman's friends who followed him, Gabriel looked exactly like the man's late son who had died in an accident 6 months ago. "But that's not me. I don't even have a car," the young man tried to reason with the businessman. The man's name was David Hall, and he owned several mining companies in Alaska. Despite all the protests of Gabriel and Sandy, the businessman strongly insisted they had to go to his place right away. Needless to say, David's proposal sounded rather crazy to the young people. After exchanging glances with Sandy, Gabriel accepted the older businessman's offer. It was only when the two came to David Hall's house that they understood why he'd been acting so strangely at the city hall. All the walls in his mansion were covered with photographs of a man who looked exactly like Gabriel. And how is that even possible? This isn't me, is it? The man whispered in surprise. The owner of the house patted Gabriel on the shoulder and invited him and Sandy into the living room. After they all took a seat, the old man told them a story that started about 25 years ago. At that time, David's wife was pregnant with twins, and the life of the future parents seemed simply perfect. Everything changed in an instant when Amanda Hall had extensive internal bleeding during childbirth. According to her doctor, only one of the twin boys had survived, while his brother and mother died at about the same time. So you see, I lived for 25 years believing that my second son was dead. And recently I lost my other son, Michael. He died in a car accident. Mr. Hall whispered with tears in his eyes. Gabriel was feeling dizzy. Apparently, because of the doctor's criminal negligence, the twins were separated at birth and one of them ended up at an orphanage. David Hall had no doubt that Gabriel was his son. It was obvious even without a DNA test. All this time, Sandy sat quietly next to Gabriel and didn't know what to say. David Hall insisted that the couple should stay overnight. But we aren't really together. Sandy was about to explain their situation, but Gabriel gently squeezed her hand and made it clear that she shouldn't rush into anything. Jumping ahead, I'd like to say that the couple did get married after all, but their marriage ended up being very real. Thanks to David Hall's help, Sandy got custody of Bobby, and together they moved in with her new husband. Of course, Gabriel had no idea how or why he ended up at the orphanage and was deprived of a happy childhood. Someone must have made a mistake, or maybe it was some kind of a scam. By and large, the man didn't want to delve into the past and look for a guilty party. Instead, he surrounded his wife and adopted son with the kind of love and care he never had in his life. Sandy reciprocated the man's feelings and quickly stopped thinking of her marriage as fake. She loved her husband with all her heart.